In the year 117, a man named Trajan looked out over territory that stretched from the moors of northern Britain to the banks of the Tigris, and he commanded roughly 1 in every 4 human beings alive on Earth. 60 million people paid taxes to a single treasury. Grain grown in Egypt fed the poor of a city 4,000 kilometers away, delivered on a schedule as reliable as anything built before the industrial age. Roads paved with cut stone ran for over 400,000 kilometers, and a courier could carry a message from the Rhine to Rome in 8 days. There were no barbarians at any gate. There was no crisis. There was only scale and order, and the quiet, total confidence of a civilization that believed it would simply continue. It would not. The fall had already started, and almost no one alive that year would have believed it had. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what it took to build it. Rome was not an empire in the way later empires were. It was a machine assembled over 500 years by men who had died long before it reached its final shape. Men like Scipio Africanus, who broke Carthage in 202 BC, and Augustus, who ended a century of civil war in 27 BC and gave the machine its first true engineer. By the 2nd century, that machine ran a postal system, a currency accepted from Spain to Syria, a legal code that outlived the empire itself, and a standing army of roughly 400,000 men, each one fed, paid, and equipped through a logistics network with no equal until the 20th century. A soldier stationed on Hadrian's Wall in Britain wore boots made from leather tanned in Gaul and carried coins minted in Antioch. Think about what that required. Think about how many separate human decisions over how many generations had to align for that to be ordinary. This was not an abstraction to the people who lived inside it. A grain merchant in Ostia depended on Egyptian wheat arriving on time, or his family did not eat that winter. A retired legionary in Cologne depended on a pension promised by a state 4,000 kilometers away actually being paid. An aristocrat in Antioch depended on Roman law protecting his property from a governor who might otherwise take it by force. Multiply these dependencies by 60 million people across 3 continents, sustained for centuries, and you begin to understand what it meant when the machine started, slowly and then quickly, to come apart. This was not a kingdom. It was an operating system for the ancient world, and operating systems do not fail all at once. They fail one silent error at a time, for a very long time, before anyone notices the crash. The flaw was there from the founding, and it was never hidden. It was structural, and it was simple. Rome had no reliable method for transferring power. Augustus solved the Republic's chaos by making himself permanent, but he never solved what came after him. There was no constitution for succession, no fixed rule, only precedent, family loyalty, and the loyalty of whichever army happened to be closest to the throne when an emperor died. For 2 centuries this worked well enough, propped up by luck and by a handful of unusually competent men. But the mechanism itself was a loaded weapon left on the table of every legion camp in the empire. Any general with enough soldiers and enough ambition could, in theory, become emperor by simply marching on Rome. Everyone who studied the state closely understood this. Historians wrote about it, senators whispered about it, and for 200 years, the empire simply hoped the gun would not go off. It went off in the year 235. In 80 years, Rome would burn through roughly 26 legitimate emperors and countless more claimants, most of them murdered by their own soldiers. But before the worst of it, there were men who saw it coming and said so, and what happened to them is worth sitting with. In the year 180, the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, dying of illness on the Danube frontier, is recorded as having grown convinced that his own son Commodus was unfit to rule, a threat to the very succession machinery he had spent his reign trying to stabilize. His advisors urged him to name a capable outsider instead, following the practice of the 4 emperors before him, none of whom had passed power to a biological son. Marcus overruled them. Commodus became emperor at 18. Within 12 years, he was strangled in his bath by a wrestler hired by his own inner circle, and the fragile peace of the 2nd century died with him. This is the moment historians still call the true beginning of the end, and it took place inside a family, not on a battlefield. 60 years later, the senator and historian Cassius Dio, who had lived through the reign of Commodus and the chaos after it, wrote that Rome's history had descended, in his words, from a kingdom of gold into one of iron and rust. He was not speaking metaphorically about morality. He was describing, with the precision of a man who had watched it happen, the literal debasement of Roman currency, the silver content of the denarius falling from 97% under Augustus to under 50% within a generation of his own writing. He understood exactly what this meant for an empire whose army, whose grain supply, whose entire civil service ran on trust in that coin. Cassius Dio was eventually forced into retirement by the very emperors whose economic policy he had diagnosed as terminal. His warning survived. His career did not. Then, in the year 251, the Emperor Decius died in a swamp in Thrace, the first Roman emperor ever killed in battle by a foreign enemy, ambushed by Gothic forces who understood something Roman commanders had not yet accepted, that the legions were no longer what they had been. A general named Trebonianus Gallus, who had actually foreseen the ambush and warned Decius against pursuing the Goths into the marsh, was overruled by an emperor desperate for a decisive victory to shore up his shaky legitimacy. Decius went anyway. 2 legions were annihilated. Gallus, the man who had been right, inherited the throne amid the wreckage and was murdered within 2 years by his own soldiers, who blamed him for a plague he did not cause and a defeat he had tried to prevent. By the 260s, the empire had effectively split into 3 competing states, and a Palmyrene queen named Zenobia had carved out a breakaway empire covering Egypt and the entire eastern provinces, openly declaring what half the empire already believed, that Rome could no longer hold itself together by consent, only by force, and increasingly, not even by that. The single moment of no return did not look like collapse. It looked like a solution. In the year 285, the Emperor Diocletian, a soldier's son from Dalmatia, who had clawed his way to the throne over the bodies of 3 rivals, sat down and concluded that one man could no longer govern an empire this large, this fast, this violent. His answer was the Tetrarchy, 4 rulers, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each governing a quarter of the empire, bound by marriage and by law to cooperate and eventually hand power to their designated successors. On paper, it was elegant. In the room where it was signed, in the year 293, it must have felt like genius, a permanent fix to the 200-year-old wound of succession. But Diocletian had built a system that depended entirely on 4 ambitious men choosing loyalty over power forever, with no enforcement mechanism beyond their own restraint. The moment he retired in 305, the one man whose authority the other 3 had never dared challenge, the system had no center left. Within 2 years, 5 rival claimants were at war. The fix had created the fracture it was meant to heal. What followed moved faster than anything before it. Constantine spent 19 years grinding down every rival tetrarch until, in 324, one man ruled again. But the empire he inherited was permanently bent toward division. In 330, he built a second capital at Byzantium and called it his own city, and from that point, the empire had 2 hearts beating on 2 different schedules. In 376, a desperate mass of Gothic refugees, fleeing the Huns, was allowed across the Danube by Roman officials who saw not a threat but a source of taxable farmhands and army recruits, and who then starved and cheated them so badly that the Goths rose up. In 378, at Adrianople, they annihilated a Roman field army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens himself, the worst defeat in Roman history since Hannibal. In 405 and 406, Germanic tribes crossed the frozen Rhine. In numbers, the Western army no longer had the manpower to repel, because that manpower had been bled dry by decades of civil wars between rival Roman claimants, each more concerned with the throne than the frontier. In 410, the Goths, under Alaric, the same people Rome had failed to honorably absorb 34 years earlier, sacked the city of Rome itself, the first time it had fallen to a foreign army in 800 years. In 439, the Vandals took Carthage, the empire's second breadbasket, and with it, the grain that had kept the West alive. In 451 and 452, Attila the Hun ravaged Gaul and Italy, while the Western government, bankrupt and unable to field an army without barbarian mercenaries, could only watch and negotiate. By 468, a massive combined fleet, sent to retake North Africa, was destroyed by fireships off the coast of Carthage, and with it went the West's last realistic chance at recovery. In 475, a Roman general of barbarian descent named Orestes installed his own teenage son as emperor. In 476, one of Orestes' own soldiers, a man named Odoacer, killed him, deposed the boy, sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, and simply declined to appoint a new emperor at all. No battle marked the end, no proclamation. A government just stopped existing, because the man in charge of it decided there was no longer any point in pretending. What remained afterward could be catalogued the way an inventory is taken after a fire. The Western imperial bureaucracy dissolved. The standing legions of the West absorbed into local warlord retinues or simply gone. The city of Rome, once home to over 1 million people at its 2nd century peak, reduced within a few generations to a population estimated in the tens of thousands. The roads, unmaintained, and within 2 centuries, largely unusable in winter. Literacy rates among the general population collapsed and would not recover in most of Western Europe for 800 years. The aqueducts, serving Rome, cut, one after another, during the sieges of the 6th century, several never repaired. Latin, once a single administrative language from Britain to North Africa, fractured within 3 centuries into the divergent tongues that would become French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. The East survived, under a different name, for another 1,000 years. The West did not survive as a state at all. The official story, then and now, blames the barbarians, the plagues, the weak emperors, the sheer bad luck of a cold climate cycle that hit precisely when Rome could least afford it. All of that happened, and none of it explains why the empire couldn't absorb any single one of those shocks the way it had absorbed worse ones centuries earlier. The real failure was never external. It was that Rome had built an economy and a military that depended on continuous territorial expansion to stay solvent, and once the expansion stopped, under Hadrian, in the 2nd century, the entire system began quietly consuming itself to cover the shortfall through debased coinage, through heavier taxation of a shrinking productive class, through an aristocracy that increasingly paid soldiers and officials in loyalty and land instead of a functioning currency. The senators who could see this happening owned enough land to insulate themselves from it. The emperors who could see it needed short-term stability more than long-term reform. Everyone who benefited from the arrangement as it was had every reason not to be the one who said out loud that the entire model was unsustainable. So they didn't. The mechanism that killed Rome has never actually gone away. A complex system, run by people whose careers depend on the next quarter and not the next century, will nearly always choose the decision that delays the reckoning over the one that prevents it. Somewhere right now, in a boardroom or a ministry or a central bank, someone understands exactly which unsustainable arrangement they are quietly extending for one more cycle. The question is not whether they know. The question is, who is listening?